To our discussion, we're looking at the year 2024 in review. The year is wrapping up, and we're looking at some of the economic indices that shape the year 2024. And of course, we'll look at the outlook for 2025. I have two very important personalities joining me on the show today. I have Adegboyega Adebajo. He's the CEO of the West African Atlantic Resources and Equity House. He joins me virtually from Lagos. Adegboyega is also an investment banker. Good morning, Dr. Adegboyega.
Morning, Yusuf. How are you?
Oh, very well.
Right.
Always a pleasure. I'm from Mina, Niger State. I have Dorothy Nuhu-Akenova. She's a women rights activist and also an entrepreneur. She was a candidate in the last 2023 general election. Mrs. Dorothy Akenova, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you very much.
All right, let me start
to be with you again.
Always a pleasure, as always. Let me start with you, Mrs. Dorothy Akenova. 2024 will come to an end tomorrow. As a business person, how will you want to be? How will you want to remember the year 2024?
I would want to see it as a period where we were very resilient. So I remember it for the resilience of Nigerians generally, but also for business entrepreneurs and myself included. The year through so many challenges at us. We continued to witness the adverse effect of the removal of the fuel subsidy and how the increment happened again and again, and how that impacted on the cost of living and how we've been able to manage, scale down, adapt, and we are still here, stronger than we were before.
Indeed, stronger than we were before. We hope we carry that resilience into 2025. Dr. Adegboyega, let me get your thoughts about 2024. It was a very challenging year indeed for Nigeria. How will you want the year to be remembered?
Well, it's no doubt the year of inflation. Average inflation rate is 34.6 year on year. And even if some people felt that it slowed down a bit over 2 months, if you look at the difference between January, what the inflation was like around January 2023, and now we're looking at about 34% now, okay? And in January, it was about 21%. It was about 29%, sorry, in January, and it's 34% now. But the truth is, those figures do not show you the real impact that inflation has had. You need to go to the markets and to check the cost and how it has impacted goods. Then we can start talking in terms of the real impact felt. So yes, it's the year of inflation. That's probably how it will be remembered. Significant rise in prices and people doing their best to meet their needs.
Indeed, people doing their best to meet their need. Still talking about the resilience of Nigeria. Let's pick out some of these issues one by one. One is the FX issue, talking about the foreign exchange market there. Of course, it has been relatively very, very volatile. And of course, the CBN has done its best to see how they can stabilize that. How much of impact do you think the CBN effort has made so far in stabilizing the naira, Dr. Adegboyega?
Well, it's funny that I have to say this, but I think we're still out there. We're not certain yet. We can't put our finger down on it and say it has done so. But I must give the CBN a lot of credit. I, for one, have wondered throughout the year why the NPL rate has consistently been increasing since the beginning of the year. In March, it was 22.75. Today, it's about
27.75
and a half. Right. So, but the central bank has indeed said that their focus is on inflation management exchange rate stability, banking sector stability, external sector considerations, and domestic economic growth. But one thing is clear. I think the CBN has, one way or the other, focused so much on the aspect of stability, and I think short-term growth considerations may have suffered in terms of this. Trying to hold back inflation, trying to keep the naira rate stable, trying to make sure our foreign reserves do not put undue pressure on the naira. All those have affected internally the capacity of the country to exhibit short-term growth. So that's my view.
Indeed, quite a major concern there as well. Let me get to Dorothy Nuhu-Akenova. You listened to Dr. Adegboyega. He did talk about some of the challenges in, CBN policies. How much of impact do you think those policies, especially we talk about the foreign exchange market, how much of impact do you think it has had on businesses in the country?
It means that we weren't able to export as much as we used to, and so many people, I can count on my hands and feet, the toes and the fingers, how many women have not been able to keep up with their businesses and have had to shut down, especially women who used to travel to Dubai, to UK, to Germany, to bring goods in, even to China, to India. Because by the time we're thinking of exchanging naira to 1,600 to $1, it is virtually impossible to gather that amount of naira and go get goods, fly them in or ship them in. Put some other costs on the items, like the shop rent, the staff, all the electricity bills and so on, and still be able to make a reasonable profit. In fact, some of the goods were just sitting down there and expiring. It, translated to a huge loss, just like our colleague from Lagos is saying. It has had very much pressure on business people within the country. So the effort at the apex level to control what is happening at the forex level and how that has basically paralyzed the effort to strengthen or even keep afloat and alive the businesses at the grassroots level. That is the ugly picture that we have of the impact of the foreign exchange challenges.
Indeed, still talking about the impact of policies on businesses. We also had the issue of a high cost of transportation, especially for those that move goods from one place to another, like you rightly pointed out. Dorothy, how much of impact do you think that has also had on cost of items in the market?
It's well, if I'm going to do percentages, I'll say 100% or even more of that on the market prices. Those days we went counting carrots. We just go and we buy carrots. This is carrot season. And for those who are health freaks, we know how much we should consume carrots to keep healthy. You now go to the market and you are counting 3 pieces of carrots for 100 naira. That's incredible. We used to get a whole polythene bag filled with that amount. So the cost of living is high, and that is the impact we are getting. It is not only impacting on goods that are exported, but also on things that are produced within the country, like the carrots and exported. We plant them here, but imagine that the person after selling carrots needs to buy goods that are imported. So it's going to show how expensive the person's life is going to be. So they put price on what they're selling, producing here, so that they can meet buying things that can be imported from other countries using the foreign exchange. Rice is expensive, seasonings are expensive. Just name it. The vegetable oil. I bought my last 25-liter jerrycan of locally produced palm oil at 45,000 naira about a month ago. And yesterday, I was going to pick it up from my mother's. And she said, oh, lucky you bought it because now it is like 76, 78,000 naira for the same quantity. That's within it. The impact is not only putting pressure in terms of how we must raise money to afford these things, but the pressure is also in the speed with which, everything is happening. Like, how do you raise just to have an amount above the minimum?
Indeed, it is a very a big challenge there that the economy is indeed facing there. Let me bring in Dr. Adegboyega and also get his reaction. Dr. Adegboyega, you've listened to Mrs. Dorothy Nuhu-Akenova. She did talk about the cost of food items in the market as well. You are in Lagos. Give us the situation in Lagos. I know you went to Lagos for public holiday. You'll be back in Abuja soon after the holidays. Tell us, how is the Lagosian are reacting to the ongoing festive celebration?
The Christmas, well, Yusuf, traffic is pretty light on the roads. There are not so many cars as you would expect. Lots of places aren't as crowded as they typically will be. The good news, though, to some is that there is a 20-30 naira reduction in petrol price. Has that increased the volume of petrol being bought? No, I do not believe so, because you can still get petrol, in a relatively short time. Even if there's a queue, you probably have 3-4 cars in front of you. But I'd like to be able to relate to the discussion held previously with Dorothy just now. And two key figures. Last week, the Lagos State Water Regulatory Commission sealed some manufacturing companies because they were supposed to pay for the use of groundwater. Now, there was a statement from the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria regarding that. And now that is not what I really want to talk about. What I'd like to speak to are two key figures that were in that statement by the Manufacturers Association. First is that the increase in manufacturing costs, and this is because, Dorothy's been speaking about small and medium-sized big businesses, but for the larger businesses, they've had a 250% increase in manufacturing costs over 2024.
That's a whole lot.
It's essentially been taxing, energy, amongst other things, and of course transportation and logistics. That has happened to them. But also another very interesting thing is that because of them having to increase the prices of their goods and pushing them out into the market, and consumers needing to adjust in terms of prioritizing what to buy and what not to buy, there is an unsold inventory of up to 1.2 billion. And I imagine that inventory is increasing on a daily basis. Someone did mention to me that 1.2 billion was a conservative estimate of the unsold inventory. So what that means is that for manufacturing companies, this year ends, the financial year end for December, it's going to be very interesting to see what their balance sheets look like, because it's not going to show that much growth if they're not able to sell as much as they would have wanted to. And so inflation has affected everything. It's starting to affect lifestyle. So festivities or no festivities, people are generally mindful of expenditure. It's affected the capacity to travel, because yes, it will appear that Lagos is even not as light as it used to be, which means a lot more people did not travel over the holidays. And you and I know very well what etiquettes were like, and what it takes to travel from one place to another, using the domestic airlines. So all these things have come into play. So and it's not just Lagos, I'm pretty sure. It's all over. Next week, when things pick up, I hope to drive to a couple of places in the southwest and to get a feel, as I sit down and talk with the persons I'm going to see. Most certainly, we're going to talk about, what the impact is, what's happening, and how business is going. And I think one thing we should bear in mind is, remember, as we have, of course, come to understand, the key thing about headline inflation is that, it includes volatile items like food and energy. So a sector I see that's going to be very, very much hit by this or impacted is the hospitality sector.
Indeed.
So it'll be interesting to see what restaurants and hotels are doing in terms of purchasing food items and trying to sell in their restaurants, in terms of keeping the hotel generator running, what they're having to pay for energy, and how that impacts the bottom line of their businesses. So yes, it's been a tough year, 2024. Like I said, it's a year of inflation in Nigeria.
Indeed. Talking about being a year of inflation, you spoke about that now earlier on. Now, inflation is currently at about 34.6%, and that is how it's ending the year. Of course, we expect the December data to come out in January as well. Of course, let's look at the challenges that we've been able to face with regards to this. We also talk about the inflation, the CBN, increasing the monetary policy rate as well. 875 basis points were added to MPR in 2024 alone, and of course that brought the MPR to 27.5% in 2024 as well. How much of impact do you think this CBN decision has had on the economy? And of course, in terms of fiscal authority support, do you think they've adequately support the CBN decisions?
Well, it's interesting you say so, because I can't but start to tie that to first the capital raising being done by banks. But I looked at some interesting figures. MPR is at 27.5%. Interbank call rates are about 1% lower than that. That's 26.5%. But deposit rates in banks, if you want to put money away for 3 months, the banks will give you 9.5% on your money. And you want to compare that with inflation at 34.6%. And so, but there's always that degree to which some moderation might exist. I don't expect banks to suddenly, increase deposit rates simply because monetary policy rates are going up. But what the MPR impacts more than anything is the lending rate. So yes, you may have a prime lending rate of 18%, which is what there is for banks generally, but who gets to borrow at prime rates? Hardly anybody. The banks are lending at about 35% now. And again, that has affected manufacturers. A lot of them would like to pay off these loans so that they do not have to bear the interest cost and adds to the cost of running their business at the same time. So what we have is very interesting. The NPR has been there, so to say, to deal with inflation. Has it been successful to some degree? I'm not certain. I think the CBN has had much better success with stabilizing the naira, if not improving its exchange rate, but stabilizing it to the dollar, than it has had with taming inflation. And yes, it must have been a bother to them, just as it has to the rest of us. So there's a lot to look forward to. I don't know if this hawkish trend will continue over into the next year. But it's important to start thinking of what we can do to start to create domestic economic growth at the grassroots level, with the small and medium companies. They're not growing at all right now. They're not feeling the impact of what's done. They can't afford to borrow. So they have shrunk themselves to the barest minimum. We just heard people aren't importing to sell anymore because they can't afford the exchange rate. So for small companies, they've shrunk. They're just barely staying afloat. They want to be there in business. And so perhaps next year, if we have a situation where there is some release on the tightness of lending rates, it may help to stimulate growth. I think what should happen now should be more of how can we try to stimulate growth with the situation of what we have. Thank you.
So Adegboyega, I listened to a very interesting submission there by you, but let's begin to look at the outlook for 2025 as well. A lot of promises, a lot of issues that we expect to unfold. The tax reform bill is still there as well. The exchange rates, of course, if you look at the benchmark that we set for 2025 budget, 1,500 naira, talking about the official exchange rate there. Of course, there is the inflation rate of 15% that the president did mention during the budget presentation is the target for 2025 as well. How much of the success do you think we can record in some of these policies proposed by the government?
Well, I do hope to a large extent that most of the clauses in the tax reforms are accepted. Because there are some very, very good growth stimulating laws in the tax bills. And I hope it passes, and it passes on time. So that's one thing. And maybe that may take care of the fiscal part of it by reducing costs or impacts on the bottom line. Small businesses may end up with a lot more money. Those earning below a certain level and being free of any tax may end up with a lot more money for consumption. And maybe we'll start to see some growth, hopefully. But yes, that's one thing about it going towards next year. The other thing is taming inflation. I'm not too sure how successful we're going to be with that. I accept there is a conscious effort to start to look at what exactly are the things causing inflation. And it's headline inflation again, it's energy and it's food. And there are steps being taken to ensure that those prices remain stable or are reduced. One thing about agriculture and food prices is when they're in season and there is a glut, prices tend to come down. So it's important that the government catches farmers at the point of planting rather than at harvest, first of all. So once the season plantings is going to start next year, it's important that the government is actively involved with the farmers all over the country, providing inputs, providing equipment, providing training, and even planning for offtake when the harvest comes in. It's a bit too late for the dry season planting season now, where we're getting into January, and by February, March, the harvest for that will happen. But again, government can actually step in for the harvest and help farmers to make sure that the food gets to the markets where they're needed. When that starts to happen and there's availability, it's inevitable that prices will moderate and adjust as well. But we need stability, both in terms of prices, in terms of exchange rates, in terms of energy prices. And hopefully we can start to see signs that we would achieve that early next year.
All right, we hope that that turned out positive, like you expressed the optimism there. Let me get back to Mrs. Dorothy Nuhu now. We lost her momentarily, but she's back online now. Let's look at some of the things that we may see in 2025. We're looking at the outlook now. There is tax, tax is going to increase based on the reform that is going on. There's also telecom company planning to also raise their tariff as well. Starlink is planning to raise internet subscription as well. How much of impact do you think these programs or policies will have on businesses that are already struggling to survive?
Well, I think that with the tax thing, first of all, I believe that we ought to expand the reach in educating Nigerians on the tax reform bill that is in the making. I think that if the people understood, especially the small scale enterprises, medium scale enterprises, understood the benefits that they had in that policy, they'd be able to put pressure on their state governments that are resisting the reform, and then that will be passed quick, because there are a few benefits there for people, especially where the turnover has been dropped from 25 million as a definition or a benchmark for small business enterprises to 50 million turnover. So people who are earning from 0 to 50 million turnover per year are exempt in, company income. So that's huge for small scale enterprise. If we could put pressure to get this into an act, and it also makes it easier for the businesses to reset the content of the bill, that is. I think that is a good starting point. However, if we are increasing subscription for access to internet, that is going to have untold suffering on very many businesses. There are people whose business is highly dependent, especially at that small scale, on access to internet. Imagine that you go to do a POS, and the people doing POS can, not recharge their subscription. Or the people who want the service and are doing transfers through their phones are not able to do the transfer because they can't afford load data. That is going to be problematic. Already as it is, we are paying a lot for mediocre services. We've traveled around. We know that people don't suffer the way Nigerians suffer to enjoy access to the internet. The service is deplorable. Of course, the providers are complaining about the infrastructure and things that they really need that they don't have. Price in putting diesel in the machines to get the machines going, and electricity bills and so on. But they are making huge profits, as we see it clearly after year. And so we are further increasing pressure on our production component as a country. And that is going to be eventually, that is meant to be the heartbeat of our economy. If we don't have production, we can't improve the economic situation of Nigerians, because unemployment will continue to persist, lack of income will continue, and so livelihoods will compromise. And then we are back to square one. We need to put effort to move from that square one and have some dignity of living for every Nigerian.
Indeed, quite a whole lot there that we expect in 2025. The business are already growing, of course, may even suffocate further if the proposals by some of the telcos and indeed internet subscribers are anything to go by. The Starlink is planning to raise their interest, the subscription rates. The telcos also want to raise tariff. So this is indeed should be, of course, a big concern for Nigeria. Now, as we begin to wrap up, Mrs. Dorothy, quite a whole lot has happened in the year last, like we've explained, but the government has also came out on several occasions to try to explain their policies. Are you satisfied with their explanation, or in any case, is your expectation met in 2024?
No, expectations are not met. I know that there's been a lot of effort. I'm not ignorant of the challenges that exist in Nigeria. We are not an easy country or come to see, because the punctures that exist in effort all around. Just look at what you do where you are and see how some sloppiness by some colleagues can impact on the output that you expect to have. Imagine that we were just on now, and then zap, I was thrown out of net, and it took several minutes for me to, so there are challenges, not only at the policy level, but at the level of the people. How do we embrace the system, and how do we relate with it? How do we work? Do we put in our best? So issues of corruption all over the place, mitigating against the goodwill and effort of people at policy making level. I'm not excusing them at all, because they could do better. Engaging with us has not been at its optimum. And there is no way we can succeed if we don't carry people along the way. We've seen spokespersons come on channels television to speak. We've seen people come on Trust TV to speak. We've seen people go on other channels to talk to Nigerians. But how many people are subscribed to these sophisticated channels to be able to hear what the government is telling them? There has to be a research on how we engage, given our own peculiar context. And we have the structure up to grassroots level that we can exploit. And so it is left for the people who are in charge of, like, the National Orientation Agency and other parastatals, to know how to reach the people and give the people a breakdown of information to how they can comprehend. Like this tax reform policy, I don't think we've done enough. Like the subsidy removal, we need to have information. We need to be abreast of how government is seeing its own progress and the challenges they are facing, and how they are planning to mitigate those challenges. The information needs to get to the grassroots level. I don't feel that we are getting enough, and that is ruining our expectations.
All right. We hope that 2025 will be indeed a better year there. Let me give Dr. Adegboyega 60 seconds to respond to the issue around budget. If you look at the budget of 2025, very bogus, 49.7 trillion naira. There is an increase by about 74% in terms of nominal terms. But if you quantify in terms of value, there's a decline of 23%.
It's the budgets really is something that we're not. It's still a work in progress at this stage, and I wouldn't want us to belabor so much about it. It's a very thick document, as you very well know, and it's important to go through and see certain linkages. I like the overview you've given, and clearly, yes. That increase, one starts to wonder. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean we're going to borrow some more? Does it mean we are going to be able to generate internally or nationally the money to be spent? But for me, there's certain things that need to be done as we go next year. Into next year, and it's not just about the state governments, but also the federal government. There needs to be an alignment. First of all, we need to do as much as we can to see that energy supply is enhanced. There is enough electricity. The supply is not sufficient in so many places around the country. Logistics and transportation improve. even if the roads aren't so good, let there be some kind of way to move things around without the impediment of corruption on the way. So it's also important to strengthen anti-corruption measures.
Absolutely.
Particularly where we're talking of enforcement personnel.
All right, Dr. Adegboyega, I must hold you there. Dr. Adegboyega Adebajo, quite a whole lot to say, but time is always not our friend. Dr. Adegboyega Adebajo, CEO of the West Atlantic Resource and Equity House, also an investment banker. I must thank you for your time talking to us all the way from Lagos. Mrs. Dorothy Nuhu-Akenova, entrepreneur, women rights activist. She's also an evangelist. I must mention that she's a politician and a candidate in the last general election. I must thank you for your time as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Wish we had more time.
Absolutely. Time is
happy to meet you.
Time is always not our friend. With that is a wrap on the show today. We'll be back again tomorrow. I am Yusuf Akogun.
New Year.